Hi, I'm Roy Del Boab, and today I'm presenting Regaining Agency as a Refugee, the Architect's Role. Our planet is divided into territories, and every person is assigned to one. In theory, this would give rights to each person globally. However, the reality is that millions of people are forced out of their assigned territories for various reasons, finding themselves refugees. A large part of my identity is being a generational refugee from a country that has been at war since 1948. The war in Palestine has displaced about 7.2 million Palestinian refugees worldwide. More than 4.3 million of those Palestinian refugees and their descendants displaced in 1948 are registered for humanitarian assistance with the United Nations. Although being a generational refugee with parents who fulfilled the average one generational mark in a refugee camp, I was raised in a top-down capitalist compound in Saudi Arabia. Stats show that there is about 70.8 million forcibly displaced people worldwide, and almost 26 million of those are refugees. 10% live in refugee camps, and 80% of those camps are in third world countries. The top 5 hosts include Germany, Sudan, Uganda, Pakistan, and Turkey. However, over 50% of refugees come from Syria, Afghanistan, and South Sudan. In order to cope with the extreme influx of refugees, several approaches have been established, such as the Handbook for Emergencies by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. Some of the major recommendations are easy access to border when possible, easy access to water supplies, geographical features, and waste management. The layout should allow for at least 4.5 square meters per refugee, and lastly, that the roads are large enough to accommodate trucks and supplies. The recommended amount of square meters per person is 5.5 and 6.5. The tents should be large enough to accommodate 4 to 6 people in a community seen as 80 people, a block at 1,250 people, a sector at 5,000 people, and a camp at 20,000 people. Two major focus points is how do refugees regain their agency through architecture provided to them, and how can we find ways to integrate bottom-up refugee settlements into top-down planning of existing cities. First, I'd like to define and redefine a few key terms in answering my thesis question. What is a refugee? As defined by the UN, it's one that flees, a person who flees to a foreign country or power to escape danger or persecution. I have redefined this as someone who is forced to flee, escaping danger, and survival to find some sense of life again. Agency is defined as the capacity of an actor to act in a given environment. I've defined it as one's livelihood, pride, sense of being, and ability to provide. A refugee camp is defined by the UNHCR as a temporary accommodation for people who have been forced to flee from their homes because of violence and persecution. I've redefined this as a place of refuge, growth, community, self-management. It begins as a restarting point for inhabitants and will always evolve into more, and it's never temporary. The evolution of refugee camps is also a major note. Refugee camps are practical during emergencies for delivering life-saving aids, but many refugees displaced are often living through protracted situations. The UN Refugee Agency initially delivers life-saving emergency aid, but also transitions into long-term care for refugees. Camps are no longer simply rows of tents, and they're communities filled with people preparing for brighter futures. History suggests that refugee camps rarely remain temporary, therefore the solution is not to continue to push them to the outskirts of cities, but find a happy medium that can afford a degree of anonymity, allowing them to escape the apparatus of humanitarian assistance and the stigma of refugees. I believe there's knowledge on how to master plan cities or neighborhoods whilst providing inclusion, but that these ideologies focus on top-down construction without room for bottom-up construction. If bottom-up construction occurs, it's seen as slums or ghettos that are excluded from the identity of the city fabric because they're viewed as worthless infrastructure that can be destroyed. Here we're looking at Jebel Hussein, which is integrated fully into the city of Amman in Jordan, and a few major refugee camps that I will discuss more in depth later, and their distances from major cities near them. I believe this is a gray space as defined by Orrin Uchafal. It's a phenomenon that is mobilized from below by marginal groups that seek to advance their lives under the radar. 3 scenarios I studied that embrace this idea: the cool and walled city, the Tower of David, and then Quinta Monroe by Elemental. Cool and walled city was originally a Chinese military fort, and around 1945, refugees who were fleeing the Chinese Civil War poured into Hong Kong, and roughly 2,000 squatters took over the fort. It evolved into an entirely walled city with housing and economy, and in the 1960s it went through major renovations and became extremely populated with over 33,000 people occupying a little more than 7 acres of land. In 1987, it was eradicated due to large amounts of crime and unsanitary living standards. Similarly, the Tower of David was originally a financial building that stopped construction due to the death of the main investor in the banking crisis of 1994. Due to the housing shortage in the early 2000s, the building was overtaken by squatters and led by ex-convicts. The building lacked elevators, running water, balcony railings, and windows, but over time, inhabitants built it up. By the time it was taken down, over 700 families inhabited the building, forming their own community. There were delivery guys, barber shops, grocery shops, church held on Sundays, and a gym. Lastly, Quinta Monroy by Elemental in Chile was partially designed and built structure that plotted for 30 families. The architects wanted to allow families to grow their spaces and add on new rooms when necessary. The form of the initial building was done to allow the residential growth efficiently without blocking out access to light and ventilation of previous rooms. Elemental refers to social housing like buying a car. It decreases in values, unlike buying a home that increases in value over time. Their objective was to change that. Refugee camps are built temporary spaces with materials that are not permanent, and over time, living in tents becomes increasingly difficult, and as families grow, tents prove to be inadequate shelter against environmental conditions. Refugees will restore to building with a variety of different materials. I started studying and exploring 5 different refugee camps, all of different sizes and in different locations. By doing so, I was able to start understanding how refugees can regain their livelihood through their architecture. It's also important to note that all of the following images of the camps have been changed in order to shed a different light on these places. It was important to my studies to show these homes as more than bare life. The rest of the work will continue to explore this idea. The first camp I looked at was the Rohingya camp in Bangladesh. The Rohingya are a Muslim ethnic minority that have fled persecution from the government in Myanmar. The camp holds over 900,000 Rohingya, and basic food and supplies come from UN agencies as well as other humanitarian NGOs. The camp is located near Bangladesh's Cox's Bazar, where seasonal monsoon rains and threats of cyclones is a character of this area. The housing is largely constructed of earth, mud, weaved wood, and that is holding a plastic tarp in place. Reinforcements include found materials such as cardboard. The camp of the map shows the density and immediate response to the terrain, and also the strip in the middle is showing an enlarged portion of the map to have a better understanding of its organization. The next camp I studied is Dadaab. It's the world's largest refugee camp and has 5 different sectors. It's grown in waves as refugees arrive escaping war and drought from Somalia, South Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Burundi, and Uganda. The 2 sectors I specifically studied are Ifo and Ifo 2. These parts were essential to study as the camp is in total an economic hub. The refugees don't solely rely on UN agencies or other humanitarian NGOs to provide for them. And over the last 25 years, Dadaab has claimed its status as a city. The materials throughout Ifo and Ifo 2 vary from corrugated metal to hammered tin, plastic tarp, and wood, among other things. The top of the Dadaab is mainly showing the Ifo camp, and Ifo 2 starts at the top left corner, but even the organizational difference is apparent in the camps. All 5 sectors are connected by a major roadway that is shown in yellow on the left. The next camp I studied was Galiwan. It hosts 8,600 Syrian refugees. The camp has 3 schools accommodating over 50% of the children in the camp. However, many still have to work to help their families make ends meet, including traveling to other cities for work. As of 2018, the shelters were upgraded to include a kitchen, shower, and bathroom. The upgrade included concrete slabs, CMU blocks, and sandwich panel roofs. The camp receives humanitarian aid from over 15 agencies, primarily the UNHCR, which has their own care center, distribution center, and registration center. The map of Gawilan shows a direct relation to the UNHCR handbook guideline, as it follows many of the handbook rules and layout. The next camp I studied is the Zaatari camp. It's the 4th largest city in Jordan and the 2nd largest refugee camp in the world. It hosts more than 80,000 refugees, presenting many infrastructural challenges. It's fairly close to the Syrian border and has become an emblematic of the Syrian refugee crisis. As the camp grows and transitions into a permanent city, the housing construction also develops as such. It's currently organized into 12 districts, and the oldest district is referred to as the Old City. It's also the most densely populated area. Similarly to Galiwan, the Zaatari camp is organized by the UNHCR, and all developments continue to follow an overall scheme from the last camp I studied is Jebel Hussein, and it's one of the earliest camps established in 1952 to host the Palestinian refugees fleeing from war. Originally, the camp was located northwest of Amman and set up for 8,000 refugees. Since then, the camp has integrated into the city and is almost unrecognizable. The camp has grown to host 29,000 refugees and many who are generational. It's hard to distinguish the architectural qualities of buildings from other areas of downtown. As shown in the map of Jabal Hassan in pink, it's very well integrated into the city of Amman and is hard to distinguish. Throughout all the camp studies, I began to see a correlation of materials used by refugees to regain their agencies, including CMU bricks, reuse of old windows and doors, wood, plastic tarps, corrugated metal, earth and mud, and prefabricated units. The next step was to understand how these camps can grow organically, how the materials used at different phases can start to indicate the increase in refugee agency. It's important to note that these studies, the homes are constantly changing color as well to explore the different layers of growth and to indicate the idea that these camps are sightless. It's purely a steady growth and increase in agency through material. The first camp is based on the UNHCR handbook guideline. It's quick, safe, easy, and provides immediate shelter. The building types are administrative, bathrooms, and tents. The second phase is 3 to 5 years into the camp life. There's an addition of market growth. The refugees are beginning to shift and adjust the tents to their needs, as well as adding plastic tarps to help stake their plot of land and increase their privacy. The next phase is the growth in administrative buildings, as well as the addition of prefabricated buildings that are an upgrade done through donations and such. There's also land that's starting to be farmed to feed the refugees and add to the economy. The final phase at this large scale is where the camp has begun to develop its own city fabric and system of growth. At this phase, there's an increase of CMU housing to host new tenants, including newer generational refugees. There's an increase in farming land and an increase in privacy usage to plot land. The next step I took was to do this at a much closer scale. And here's a close-up of the last phase we just saw, where there's a mixture of tents, prefab homes, and CMU housing. Eventually, everyone starts to plot out their own lands, and the increase of prefab units are added as there's more camp donations, people are getting money, and the camp is growing. At some point, all the tents have upgraded into CMU housing or prefab units, and at this phase, the tenants have claimed their plotted lands, and doing so not through just plastic tarps, but more efficient in terms of CMU bricks as fences or corrugated metal. And this is the final phase of camp growth and development that I studied. I see this phase into 60 years into the camp life. And we see growth according to family sizes, using the same plots of land assigned at early stages and growing depending on the money they have gained and the aid in the camp. The markets are also growing and becoming more prominent. Now to compare the first camp and the last camp that I had prototyped, from a quote by Bram Jansen, he says, this modest urban term in refugee camp studies not only highlights the emergence of vibrant and diverse markets, cosmopolitanism, and self-management in places deemed bleak and dependent, it also shows how the academic gaze has moved beyond emergency epistemes and humanitarian and normative discourses to recognize a normalization of the geography of the camp in which people settle down, engage in economic lives, and reform a political body. After exploring the growth of a bottom-up camp, I began to question at what phase does this intersect with top-down architecture in cities, how these camps, although envisaged as temporary humanitarian constructions in a particular socio-spatial organization, materialize that bears resemblance to forms of urban life. I looked through the typologies I had imagined and how they grew throughout the camps, including housing, markets, and administrative buildings. To do so, I started to look at what are the general positives and negatives of a refugee camp and what can we carry forward and what are things that we can leave behind. I also looked at the guideline for urban shelters set up by the Norwegian Refugee Council, which is a humanitarian non-governmental organization, much like the UNHCR. And although their guideline isn't set up directly for refugee camps, it starts to mitigate issues that are seen when setting up an urban shelter and some strategies that have been used firsthand in order to do so. And now, as top-down is seen as a tool for modernization, we've seen refugee camps and bottom-up situation modernize in less than a generation. Give refugees the opportunity to gain their own agency through hyper-bottom construction methods imposed on top-down urbanization and the relationship of both to provide a livelihood and modernization in close quarters. I prototyped different scenarios in which they could be a partial build that would allow refugees to continue growing, and that way we aren't restricting who they are as people and putting them in completely unfamiliar spaces. Rather, we're allowing them to regain their agency, but also addressing the handbooks for necessities when facing an emergency. The last step was to begin understanding these bottom-up camps in relation with top-down cities and where can they take place. It's inevitable that there will be refugees from all different situations in the near future, such as climate refugees. And the step to including this foundation to regaining their agency close to the city life is important. And that is all. Thank you.